In 1823, a man named Jedediah Smith walked out of the Rocky Mountains with his scalp barely attached to his skull. A grizzly bear had ripped it clean off his head, and Smith, covered in blood and half-conscious, calmly told one of his men to sew it back on. Then he kept going. He crossed 300 miles of wilderness alone, surviving on traps fashioned from willow branches and strips of raw animal hide, eating whatever those traps caught, sleeping in snow with no backup, no signal, and no way home except his own 2 feet. Now think about that for a second. Today, most people can't start a campfire without a tutorial. And yet, men like Smith didn't just survive out there, they thrived. They built a civilization from the edge of nothing, using tools so effective and so precisely engineered for the wild that the knowledge behind them was passed down for over a century from fathers to sons around campfires stretching from the Appalachians all the way to the Pacific. Then, in the span of a few decades, almost all of it vanished. We are counting down 25 of the most remarkable tools and traps the American frontier ever produced, weapons and devices that fed families, built settlements, and shaped a wilderness into a nation. Some of them are illegal now, some haven't been used in 100 years. Number 14 on this list brought down 400-pound black bears, using nothing but a freshly cut log and the force of gravity. Number 3 was so effective that game wardens have banned it in 38 states. And number 1 was so central to the mountain man's daily existence that frontier legends carried it into every fight, every hunt, and every survival situation they ever faced. Hit subscribe before we get into this, because what you're about to hear is the kind of knowledge that doesn't exist in any school, any app, or any store. It was earned the hard way, and most of it has almost completely disappeared from this continent. Number 25. Before any boy on the frontier ever touched a rifle, before he learned to trap or set snares or read animal sign, he was handed a carved piece of wood and told to practice. The rabbit stick, sometimes called a throwing club or a kylie, was the entry point into the entire world of frontier hunting. It looked simple. A short curved length of seasoned hardwood, usually hickory or Osage orange, no longer than your forearm, weighing just under a pound. But in the right hands, it was a precision instrument. The curve wasn't decorative. That slight bend in the wood generated a horizontal spin as it flew, stabilizing it through the air the way rifling stabilizes a bullet. A skilled mountain man could send that piece of hickory spinning across a draw and break a rabbit's spine at 30 yards, mid-stride, without making a sound. No smoke, no crack, no spooked game for half a mile in every direction. Lewis and Clark recorded Shoshone hunters knocking jackrabbits off the ground while still on horseback in 1806. Entire Ozark families were still passing down their carved rabbit sticks into the 1920s, long after rifles became standard. In a world where gunpowder and lead were precious and scarce, the ability to feed a family without spending a single grain of either was worth more than most people today can imagine. That curved piece of hickory hanging by the cabin door wasn't a relic. It was dinner. Number 24. The oldest game call in the American woods wasn't made in a factory. It was made from the remains of the last bird the hunter had killed. The turkey wing bone call used the hollow radius and ulna of a wild gobbler, boiled clean, scraped of marrow with a sharpened twig, and fitted together with pine pitch into a tube no longer than a pinky finger. The sound it produced, a soft, trembling hen yelp was accurate enough that long-bearded toms came in from half a mile away without hesitation. Cherokee hunters in the southern Appalachians had been using this call for 400 years before European settlers arrived. The technique passed between cultures so naturally that by the early 1800s, you couldn't tell a Scots-Irish mountain man's call from a Cherokee hunter's by ear. Every man who carried one kept it tucked inside his powder horn to protect it from moisture, because a wet wing-bone call was useless. And a missed turkey in October could mean a hungry November. Mass-produced slate and box calls arrived after 1900, and the wing-bone call slowly disappeared. But old-timers in West Virginia have always maintained that a wing-bone call made from your own bird has a quality of tone that no factory has ever replicated. The knowledge of how to build one faded with the generation that last needed it to eat. Number 23. During the November rut, when buck deer lose their minds chasing does through frost-covered hollows, the mountain man who had the right call owned the woods. The grunt tube was hand-carved from a section of river cane or elderberry with the pith pushed out. 5 inches of hollow plant stem with a rawhide reed stretched over one end and bound with sinew. When blown with the right pressure, it produced the low, guttural grunt of a dominant buck on the move, a sound that could pull a cautious 8-pointer charging straight across a creek bottom. In the Cumberland Gap region during the 1830s, a well-tuned grunt tube was a tradable commodity. Men swapped them for jugs of whiskey and pounds of gunpowder, because a good call in the right holler meant the difference between a full smokehouse and an empty one come January. The skill was entirely in the reed tension. Too tight, and it squeaked like a startled rabbit. Too loose, and it bleated like something already dying. Every hunter carved his own, and every hunter swore his was the best in the county. The injection-molded plastic commercial call arrived after World War II and never left. What was once as common as knowing how to sharpen a knife now lives in the hands of a small group of traditionalists who learned from grandfathers who learned before the world changed. Number 22. If you wanted to hunt quietly in territory where a rifle shot would start a war, you needed the sinew-backed bow. Built from a carefully shaped stave of Osage orange or Pacific yew, the bowyer scraped the wood to exact dimensions, then glued strips of hand-pounded deer sinew along the back, using hide glue rendered from animal hooves. As the sinew dried, it contracted, pre-stressing the bow in a way that gave it dramatically more power than plain wood of the same size. A properly built sinew-backed bow pulled 60 pounds and could drive a stone-tipped arrow completely through a buffalo's ribcage at 40 yards. Jim Bridger, one of the greatest wilderness scouts who ever lived, was said to carry one specifically for hunting in Blackfoot territory, where a rifle shot brought armed war parties running within minutes. The bow made no sound, left no smoke, gave away no position. The entire process of building one properly took 3 months of patient, precise work. Today, fewer than a few hundred people in all of North America possess the knowledge to do it correctly. Traditional archery communities keep fragments of the skill alive, but the idea of a 12-year-old boy building his own hunting bow from a backyard tree, something perfectly ordinary in 1830, has been gone from American life for a very long time. Number 21. The first trap every mountain man taught his son required no steel, no springs, and no purchased materials of any kind. The figure 4 deadfall trigger was carved from 3 sticks using nothing but a hatchet and a pocket knife, an upright, a diagonal brace, and a notched trigger stick cut at precise angles that held a 50-pound rock or log perfectly balanced until an animal touched the bait. Then the whole structure collapsed in an instant. The entire apparatus cost nothing and weighed less than a biscuit. In the 1840s, Rocky Mountain fur trappers set dozens of figure-4 deadfalls overnight, while their steel beaver traps ran in the streams, catching pine martens, fishers, and ermine without firing a single shot. The geometry was everything. Too shallow a notch, and the rock fell on its own, wasting the sight. Too deep, and the animal stole the bait without tripping the trigger. A master trapper could carve all 3 sticks to the right angles in under 2 minutes with a folding knife. The knowledge spread into Boy Scout manuals through the 1950s, then faded when trapping became regulated and factory gear became the standard. Today, fewer than 1 in 100 outdoorsmen could build a working figure-4 from scratch. That ratio used to be reversed. Every boy on the frontier knew it before he knew anything else. Number 20. A mountain man's powder horn told you everything about who he was. Hollowed from a cow or buffalo horn, plugged with a hand-whittled wooden stopper, and scraped translucent so the hunter could read its powder level by holding it to the sun. The powder horn was the most personal object a man owned on the frontier. Not his rifle, not his knife, his horn. Because without dry powder in working condition, everything else was useless. The finest horns were works of art. Men carved maps into them. The mountains they'd crossed, the rivers they'd traced, the passes no one else knew. They engraved their names and dates and Bible verses and the silhouettes of animals taken in seasons past. At the 1833 Green River Rendezvous, an elaborately decorated horn sold for $6, nearly a month's wages for a working man. Every trapper developed his own technique for measuring out a precise charge without spilling a grain, because wasted powder was money on the ground, and damp powder could get you killed when you needed a shot most. When metallic cartridges arrived after the Civil War, the powder horn became obsolete almost overnight. In less than a decade, a tool that had sat at the center of American frontier life for 2 centuries was reduced to a decorative antique. The tradition of turning them into personal records of a man's entire life in the wilderness died right alongside it. Number 19. What a mountain man chose to carry in his possibles bag was a direct window into his experience. The bag itself was a leather satchel worn across the chest, made from deer skin, tanned with brain solution until it was softer than flannel. Inside, flint and steel, charred cloth for catching sparks, patch material cut from worn linen shirts, spare flints, a small bone-handled knife, a ball screw for extracting stuck lead, maybe a twist of tobacco or a strip of dried venison. Every man heading up the Missouri River by 1830 carried one, and experienced trappers could read a stranger's bag the way you might read a resume. A greenhorn's bag rattled with unnecessary gadgets, tools for every possible scenario, most of them never used. A veteran's bag held only what he had actually needed in the last 90 days. Every item proven in the field, every ounce earned. The possibles bag represented a philosophy of self-reliance that has no clean equivalent in modern life. We carry devices that connect us to everything and help us do nothing independently. The mountain man's bag was the opposite. It connected him to nothing and made him capable of everything. That idea of ruthlessly curated tools, chosen after hard lessons in the wild, faded the moment survival stopped being a daily requirement. Number 18. A mountain man who ran out of lead in the middle of an expedition had two options: find a way to make more, or stop being a mountain man. The ball mold solved that problem with elegant simplicity. Forged from iron by a gunsmith, hinged like pliers, with a spherical cavity inside and a small pouring hole at the top. It could be used at any campfire, anywhere in the world. Melt the lead in an iron ladle, pour it into the mold, wait 10 seconds, snap the halves open, and a perfectly round rifle ball dropped out, gleaming silver and ready to load. A single pound of lead, which cost 8 cents in St. Louis in 1835, yielded roughly 16 rifle balls. A trapper who packed in enough lead bars at the spring rendezvous could keep an entire brigade supplied for a full year. The independence this gave a man in the deep wilderness was almost impossible to overstate. It meant the frontier had no logistical boundary, because ammunition could be manufactured wherever there was fire. When factory-loaded cartridges arrived after 1870, ball molds became curiosities. Today, fewer Americans cast their own bullets than keep bees. An entire dimension of practical self-sufficiency has simply ceased to exist. Number 17. The smallest tool on this list may have been the most critical. The patch knife was a blade no more than 3 inches long, worn on a leather thong around the neck, and it had exactly one purpose: cutting the cloth patch that wrapped each rifle ball before it went down the barrel. The patch sealed the bore, gripped the rifling grooves, and made the difference between a rifle that could hit a target at 200 yards and one that couldn't hit a barn at 50. Every trapper kept his patch knife at a level of sharpness that most modern knife owners never approach. A ragged cut left a patch that tore when rammed home, which meant a ball that tumbled in flight, which meant a miss. Miss a deer in October, and your family goes hungry. Miss a charging grizzly at 10 feet, and you don't walk away. Many trappers forged their own patch knives from files or broken razors, fitting handles of bone or antler, because commercial versions weren't always up to the standard the work demanded. Frontier journals mention the patch knife more frequently than the rifle itself. When the muzzle-loader era ended, the patch knife vanished with it, along with the entire discipline of precise, ritual loading that had defined American rifle shooting for over a century. Number 16. In 1840, you could walk into any settlement on the edge of the frontier and ask a serious hunter what rifle he wanted above all others, and the answer was always the same. Built by brothers Samuel and Jacob Hawken out of their shop in St. Louis, the Hawken rifle was the standard against which every other firearm on the frontier was measured. 10 pounds of iron and curly maple, a 38-inch octagonal barrel, .54 caliber, capable of dropping a buffalo at 200 yards and hitting a playing card at 100. A new Hawken cost $25 in 1840, roughly 3 months of wages for a laborer. Trappers went into debt to own one. Jim Bridger carried a Hawken. Kit Carson carried a Hawken. Jedediah Smith carried a Hawken. The rifle was legendary for holding up in the worst conditions the frontier could produce: freezing rain, alkali dust, all others. And the answer was always the same. Built by brothers Samuel and Jacob Hawken out of their shop in St. Louis, the Hawken rifle was the standard against which every other firearm on the frontier was measured. 10 pounds of iron and curly maple, a 38-inch octagonal barrel, .54 caliber, capable of dropping a buffalo at 200 yards and hitting a playing card at 100. A new Hawken cost $25 in 1840, roughly 3 months of wages for a laborer. Trappers went into debt to own one. Jim Bridger carried a Hawken. Kit Carson carried a Hawken. Jedediah Smith carried a Hawken. The rifle was legendary for holding up in the worst conditions the frontier could produce: freezing rain, alkali dust, blizzards, mud. Situations where cheaper guns seized up and failed. Between 1815 and 1858, the brothers hand-built roughly 5,000 rifles, each one individually fitted to its owner. Original Hawkens sell at auction today for upwards of $100,000. But what no amount of money can buy back is the knowledge of how to load one correctly, maintain it through a brutal winter, and shoot it the way the men who depended on it could shoot. That knowledge left the world with the last generation of men who needed it to live. Number 15. If you wanted to understand the economy that built the American frontier, you needed to understand one device: the Newhouse Number 4 beaver trap. Manufactured by the Oneida community in upstate New York, starting in 1848. It was a heavy steel leg-hold trap, 5 pounds of iron with jaws that spread 7 inches, built to last 20 years with proper care. It cost $1.50 wholesale. A skilled trapper would set it in shallow water near a beaver slide, anchored to a heavy stake in the creek bed, with a twig dipped in castoreum bait just above the pan. When a beaver investigated the scent, its foreleg touched the pan, and the jaws snapped shut with enough force to hold a 60-pound animal until dawn. In a strong season, one man running a trap line could take 400 beaver pelts, each worth $4 to $6 in St. Louis. 3 months of brutal labor in freezing water, and a man came out with a year's wages. The Oneida factory closed in 1925. But the knowledge that made the trap useful, reading beaver sign in mud and snow, knowing where on a slide to place a set, masking human scent from an animal that can smell a boot print through 3 inches of water, passed into history with the last generation of full-time trappers who learned it as children. Number 14. If the steel beaver trap was precision work, what comes next was something else entirely. The log deadfall, sometimes called a Samson trap, sometimes a bear fall, was the largest, most brutal trap ever built on the frontier, requiring nothing more than a freshly cut log, a sharp axe, 2 men, and a full day of hard work. The principle was straightforward. Cut a log weighing between 300 and 500 pounds, prop it up on a figure-4 trigger, and bait it so a black bear had to reach directly underneath to get to the food. When the trigger released, a fraction of a second, the log fell 3 to 4 feet and broke the bear's spine before the animal had time to react. There was no escape. In the southern Appalachians during the 1820s, a bear hide sold for $3 and the rendered fat for another $2, making one successful deadfall worth a full week of skilled labor. Getting the construction right took real expertise. The trigger had to hold under enormous pressure, but release at the slightest contact. Set it wrong, and the log fell on its own, ruining the sight. Set it right, and the same structure could be rebaited and used for decades. The last working bear deadfalls in North America were reportedly still active in the Great Smoky Mountains as late as the 1940s. Then they were outlawed, the sites abandoned, and within a single generation, the construction knowledge was completely gone. Number 13. Before a mountain man set a single trap in beaver country, he needed something more valuable than steel and more carefully guarded than his rifle. Castoreum, a thick yellowish-brown musk extracted from the scent glands near a beaver's tail, was the secret weapon that separated full packs from empty ones. When a trapper killed a beaver, he carefully removed both glands, tied them off with sinew, and hung them to cure over a smoky campfire for a week. What resulted was a paste so irresistible to other beavers that an animal would cross an entire creek and climb completely out of the water just to investigate the source. By the 1830s, 1 ounce of prime castoreum could sell in St. Louis for $5, more than the pelt of the beaver that produced it. Every experienced trapper kept his own recipe. Some added cloves, cinnamon, or wild anise, swearing their blend drew animals from further downstream and held scent longer through cold. Joe Meek, one of the most colorful mountain men of his era, was said to have a formula so potent it pulled beaver from 2 miles away. He never shared it with anyone. The beaver hat went out of fashion in Europe around 1840, and the fur trade collapsed almost immediately. Castoreum lost its market value practically overnight. Today, it survives as a flavoring agent in certain perfumes and processed foods. The art of blending it for trapping is known to perhaps 100 people in the entire country. Number 12. Some tools from the frontier era can be romanticized. The pit trap cannot. Dug 6 feet deep in hard ground along a known game trail, lined with sharpened stakes of seasoned hickory driven into the floor, then covered with thin sticks topped with leaves and natural debris. It was the most primitive trap on this list, and it was viciously effective. An elk or deer stepping on the covering fell straight down onto the stakes before it understood what was happening. Most states had banned the pit trap by 1900, and for good reason. It killed without discrimination. Livestock fell into them. Dogs disappeared. In documented cases, children wandering near a covered pit suffered the same fate as the game it was meant for. But in the remote hollows of Kentucky and West Virginia, where families needed meat and couldn't afford to waste ammunition, pit traps were reportedly still being used into the 1920s. The construction alone was backbreaking. 3 days of digging in hard ground, careful stake placement, constant maintenance through wet weather. The technique of sighting, disguising, and refreshing a pit trap came originally from Native American hunters and spread through Appalachian culture over generations. Outside of a handful of survival schools, it's now effectively extinct as practical knowledge. Number 11. Where the deadfall used brute mass and the pit trap used depth, the spring-pole snare used something more elegant, stored energy. Also called a twitch-up, it turned a bent sapling into a living spring. A mountain man would select a young birch or maple no thicker than his thumb, bend it down under full tension, and connect a delicately balanced trigger mechanism to the tip. A braided sinew loop ran through the trigger and sat across a game trail at exactly rabbit head height. When an animal stepped into the loop and moved forward, that slight motion tripped the trigger. The sapling snapped upright and the animal was hoisted 3 feet off the ground before it knew what happened. Death was fast, and because the carcass hung in the air, it was protected from scavengers until the trapper arrived. A single trapper could set 30 or 40 spring-pole snares along a mile of trail in an afternoon and check the entire line in 2 hours the next morning. In Maine's North Woods, during the 1860s, snares like these provided the majority of the meat that fed entire logging camps through the winter. The geometric precision of the trigger, which had to hold under the full tension of a bent sapling, but release at the barely there touch of a passing rabbit, required physical intuition about leverage and tension that no manual could teach. You learned it from someone who already knew. And when that chain broke, the knowledge broke with it. Number 10. Before wire cage traps, the mountain man who wanted a live animal with an undamaged pelt built a box trap. Constructed from hand-split cedar slabs, pegged together without a single nail, roughly 3 feet long and 1 foot wide, with a guillotine-style door held open by a trigger stick, connected to a baited treadle on the inside floor. When a fox, raccoon, or bobcat stepped on the treadle to reach the food, the door dropped behind it, and the animal was held alive and uninjured until the trapper came to collect. Live capture mattered because an intact pelt, no trap damage, no bite wounds, could be worth twice as much as a damaged one at the trading post. By the 1850s, virtually every homestead in the Ohio Valley had at least one box trap sitting at the edge of the cornfield, dealing with the raccoons that would otherwise eat the harvest. The construction required patient carpentry. Too loose, and the animal forced its way out overnight. Too stiff, and the door didn't drop fast enough. Building one properly took a full day with only hand tools. Factory-made wire cage traps replaced wooden box traps after 1920, and the carpentry knowledge faded with the generation of Americans who grew up shaping wood by hand. Number 9. Some of the oldest fishing technology on the North American continent is still visible in Appalachian streams today, if you know what to look for. In summer, when water levels drop, you can sometimes see arrangements of river stones forming ghostly chevron shapes on the creek bed. These are the remains of fish weirs built by Cherokee and Catawba hunters centuries before any European arrived. The design was brilliantly simple, a V-shaped fence of watermelon-sized stones stretching across a shallow stream, with the point aimed downstream and a wicker basket trap at the apex. Fish swimming upstream followed the fence into the narrowing gap, entered the basket, and couldn't find the exit. During the spring smelt runs in New England and the fall whitefish migrations in the Great Lakes region, a single well-built weir could produce 200 pounds of fish in one night. No bait, no hooks, no waiting. Mountain men adopted the technique quickly wherever they found good trout water. By the early colonial period, the Massachusetts government had passed laws limiting weir construction because native designs were so efficient they threatened upstream fish populations. The stone ruins in those streams are all that remains. The knowledge of how to site, angle, and maintain one is held by archaeologists, not fishermen. Number 8. If the weir was the patient man's tool, the gig was for the man who wanted action. A multi-pronged spear forged with 3 barbed iron tines, the gig was the weapon of choice for night hunting along shallow streams and pond edges. A mountain man would tie a burning pine knot, torch to the front of his dugout canoe, drift silently down a dark creek at midnight, and drive the gig into whatever surfaced in the flickering light below. The barbed tines kept speared fish from wiggling free, and a man with a good eye could fill a burlap sack with bullfrogs in a single hour. In the Ozark Mountains and the swamplands of Louisiana, gigging was as much a community tradition as a food-gathering method. Families went out together on warm summer nights, cooking whatever they caught over driftwood fires on sandbars, while the adults worked the water. By the 1960s, most states had heavily regulated gigging because the technique was simply too efficient for small streams to sustain. The forged multi-tine gig head that once hung in every country hardware store for 50 cents is now a specialty item ordered online. A tradition that lasted centuries in those hollows is nearly gone in a single generation. Number 7. While gigging was spectacular, the quiet workhorse of frontier fishing was far more productive over time. The trot line was nothing more than a length of heavy cord stretched across a river or lake, with as many as 50 baited hooks hanging from it on shorter drop lines at regular intervals. Set it at dusk, bait it with cut shad or live crawfish, and run it again at dawn. What happened in between was the river doing the work. A well-placed trot line on the Mississippi in 1855 could pull 80 pounds of catfish, walleye, and bass in a single night. Enough protein to feed a frontier family for a week or to smoke and trade at the nearest settlement. The skill wasn't in the fishing itself, it was in the rope work. Splicing droppers to the main line at consistent intervals, tying loops that held under a struggling fish, rigging swivels correctly to prevent the line from twisting into uselessness overnight. Knot tying skills that took years to master and were passed from father to son with the same seriousness as any other trade. Trot lining remains legal in most southern states, but it's become a niche practice. Fewer than 2% of American anglers have ever set one. The braiding and rigging knowledge that went into a proper handmade line has largely disappeared from everyday life. Number 6. This one came from the open plains, arriving in the American hunting toolkit through a cultural exchange between mountain men and Mexican vaqueros working the Santa Fe Trail. Bolas consisted of 3 stone weights, each around 8 ounces, tied to the ends of braided rawhide cords, roughly 3 feet long, and connected at a central point. In the hands of a skilled thrower, they became a long-range entangling weapon, unlike anything the frontier had produced on its own. A mountain man who had time on the Santa Fe Trail learned to whip the bolas around his head twice, release it at precisely the right moment, and watch the 3 cords spiral around a running pronghorn's legs, mid-stride, dropping the animal without a sound and without damaging the hide. The stones had to be carefully matched in weight so the weapon flew true. The cords had to be braided from elk or buffalo rawhide for durability. The technique had been refined by gauchos in South America over centuries, and it translated to the American plains almost perfectly. After 1860, as firearms became cheaper and more accessible, most American hunters moved on. Today, gauchos in Argentina and Uruguay still use bolas in daily ranching work, exactly as they did 5 centuries ago. On this continent, it is practiced by perhaps a few hundred hobbyists who understand what was lost. Number 5. 6 feet long, perfectly straight, bored from river cane until the inside was smooth as polished glass. The blowgun was the silent hunting weapon of the Cherokee Nation, and one of the most precisely engineered tools the American wilderness ever produced. Cherokee hunters had been using it for generations before European settlers arrived, and Scots-Irish mountain families who moved into the southern Appalachians after 1800 adopted it almost immediately, because once you saw what it could do in dense cover, arguing with the results was impossible. The cane had to be cut green and dried in a straightening rack. then bored out with a red-hot iron rod until every internal node was gone and the bore was perfectly smooth end to end. Darts were made from locust wood splinters, fletched with tightly wound thistle down that formed an airtight seal and tipped with sharpened hickory. Cherokee hunters in the early 1800s could group 10 darts inside a circle the size of a silver dollar at 30 feet, with no sound but a soft puff of breath. In the dense laurel thickets of the Great Smokies, where a rifle shot echoed for miles and drove every deer out of the hollow, the blowgun was simply better than a firearm for small game. The last traditional Cherokee blowgun maker of note was a craftsman named Hayes Lasaya. He died in 2016. With him went 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge about cane selection, straightening, and bore precision. What took generations to perfect was lost in a single lifetime. Number 4. Strip away every manufactured tool from this entire list. Take away the steel traps, the ball molds, the powder horns. What remains? The absolute bedrock survival weapon of the American wilderness is a sharpened stick hardened in fire. But do not let that description fool you. The fire-hardened spear worked through a precise thermodynamic principle. When green wood is slowly rotated over a low fire just below scorching temperature, the sustained heat drives internal moisture out of the cellular structure without charring the surface. What remains is wood permanently transformed, denser, harder, capable of holding a point sharper than many steel blades. A 6-foot spear cut from dogwood or ash could kill a wild hog at close quarters, drive into a salmon in a fast-moving stream, or hold off a mountain lion long enough to matter. Daniel Boone's 1769 Kentucky expedition journals describe his party making fire-hardened spears when their powder supply ran dangerously low. The technique appears in Boy Scout manuals as late as 1965. What made it a skill rather than just a task was the rotation, maintaining that exact temperature for 20 to 30 minutes, reading the color and smell of the wood to know when to stop. Too much heat and the point charred into brittleness. Too little and the wood stayed soft. Today this is taught only in primitive survival schools. Outside those contexts, the vast majority of outdoorsmen could not produce a functional spear if their lives depended on it. Number 3. This one is banned in 38 states, and when you understand what it could do, that fact becomes completely understandable. The foothold wolf set was the most effective and the most controversial predator trap ever used on the American frontier. A mountain man would carefully excavate a shallow bed in a well-traveled game trail, set a massive Newhouse long spring trap with 14-inch jaws, cover the entire mechanism with sifted dirt until it was completely invisible, and anchor it to a drag log heavy enough to prevent an animal from sprinting away, but light enough that constant struggling didn't allow a clean escape. The trap was positioned 15 feet from a rotting carcass or bait station, close enough that a wolf approaching the food had to step directly over the hidden pan. One step, and 14 inches of iron snapped shut around a foreleg with enough force to hold an animal over 100 pounds through a night of struggling and freezing temperatures. In the 1870s and 1880s, professional wolf hunters on the northern plains could take 300 wolves in a single winter at $4 a hide. Fortunes built through the precise, repetitive mastery of this one technique. The traps are banned now because they do not discriminate. Eagles have been caught in them, dogs. In documented cases, people have stepped into improperly retrieved sets. The knowledge of how to deploy one responsibly, masking human scent, anchoring for different terrain, dispatching a trapped animal quickly, was transmitted across generations and now exists only in scattered old handbooks and the memories of a very small number of aging men. Number 2. 10,000 years before the bow existed on this continent, hunters were already bringing down large game at distance using a device most people today have never heard of. The atlatl, a carved wooden throwing stick roughly 24 inches long with a hook at one end, extended the effective length of the human arm by 3 feet and transformed the physics of throwing entirely. A lightweight dart, typically 6 feet long and tipped with stone or bone, was laid along the length of the atlatl with its base engaged on the hook. With a single smooth, whipping throw, a skilled hunter could launch that dart at 100 miles per hour. At 40 yards, an atlatl dart hit with more energy than a crossbow bolt. It penetrated deer hide cleanly and drove deep enough to reach vital organs. Pennsylvania Dutch settlers in the 1700s adopted the atlatl from the Lenape people, specifically because it was quieter than a rifle, lighter than a bow, and in dense forest cover, often more practical than either. The throwing stick took about a week to carve, with a counterweight near the hook end that increased the snap of the throw and improved accuracy. By 1850, widespread firearms had made the atlatl functionally obsolete for hunting in North America. A few isolated Appalachian communities continued using it into the early 1900s. Atlatl competitions exist today in a scattered handful of states, kept alive by enthusiasts. But the actual hunting tradition, the daily knowledge of how to use a carved stick to feed a family, is completely gone. A technology that endured for 10,000 years on this continent was replaced in a single century. Number 1. At every rendezvous, in every trapping camp, on every expedition from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, one object appeared in the gear of virtually every serious man who worked the American wilderness. It wasn't the rifle, it wasn't the trap, it was the knife. And not just any knife, specifically the Green River, forged at the Russell Cutlery Factory in Green River, Massachusetts, starting in 1834. It had a 6-inch carbon steel blade with a wide belly designed for skinning, a simple wooden handle riveted through the full tang, and an edge that could be stropped to razor sharpness on the back of a leather boot. At the annual rendezvous, it sold for 75 cents. That price point, the fact that even the poorest trapper could afford one, is what made it universal. But affordability alone didn't explain its dominance. The Green River knife was the best all-purpose blade available anywhere on the continent for the work that mountain men actually did. It skinned beaver without tearing the membrane that reduced pelt value. It butchered elk carcasses in freezing water for hours without the handle becoming slippery. It shaved wood for fire, starting with the same edge it used to cut supper. It could be honed sharp again in 3 minutes on a flat river stone. Every trapper carried at least one. Some carried 3. The phrase, "up to Green River," entered frontier slang as an expression meaning to go all the way, completely, and without hesitation, because during close quarters confrontations, the blade was often driven all the way in, up to the Green River stamp on the ricasso. Jedediah Smith, the same man who opened this story with a bare-mauled scalp and 300 miles of wilderness between him and civilization, was killed by a Comanche war party on the Cimarron River in 1831 with a Green River knife in his hand. He had crossed half a continent with nothing but his tools and his knowledge. And at the moment it counted most, that knife was the last thing he reached for. Original Green River knives from the fur trade era sell at auction today for thousands of dollars. What cannot be purchased at any price is the knowledge that went with them, the feel of a proper edge, the angle that holds sharpness through a full day of wet work, the grip that gives control through bone and hide without fatigue. The craftsmen who understood how to hand forge carbon steel to those specifications are gone. The last men who used these knives the way they were meant to be used are gone. And the frontier that made them necessary has been gone for over a century. From the humble rabbit stick at number 25 to the legendary Green River knife at number 1. Every tool and trap on this list is more than an object. It's a record. Encoded in wood and iron and sinew, these tools document what human beings were once required to know simply to make it through a winter. The accumulation of generations of trial and error, failure and refinement, knowledge tested in the harshest possible conditions and passed forward because lives depended on it being passed correctly. The figure 4 deadfall, the hawk and rifle, the spring pole snare, the blowgun, the fire-hardened spear. Each one tells the same story. There was a time in this country when a man's most valuable possession wasn't something he bought. It was something he knew. That knowledge, built painstakingly over a century and a half of frontier life, faded in the span of 2 or 3 decades when the supermarket replaced the hunt and the factory replaced the forge. The tools are mostly gone. The men who built them are gone. But the knowledge isn't entirely gone yet. In the hollows of Appalachia and the high country of the Rockies, there are still a few people who carry it. They're older than they used to be, and there are fewer of them every year. The real question isn't whether these skills are remarkable. They clearly are. The question is whether we'll find a way to learn from the last people who still hold them, before the last campfire goes out and takes everything with it.